You bet.
Cool. Thanks so much, Justin. Yeah, really, thank you all for jumping on and for anyone who's watching the recording afterwards. So, yeah, really excited to be here and talk a little bit about what Responder Alliance is and what we do, and kind of more generally how industry standards are changing and shifting and really developing into something really cool around how we mitigate stress in ourselves, our teammates, and our subjects in the field. So a lot of really cool developments happening. There's some new announcements, and some of you, I'm sure, have seen many of the tools that I'm going to be talking about before, but it might be new to some folks as well. So yeah, this is really going to be kind of an introduction, and then from there, we're going to just continue building out this partnership and have more opportunities for y'all to learn. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let's make sure I have permission for that. Cool. Okay, so let's see. A little bit about Responder Alliance first. So, at Responder Alliance, we're a training center where we teach best practices and tools for stress mitigation in the field. And we work with field responders of all different types. So, it tends to be mostly the austere rescuer, whether that's mountain rescue or ski patrol or avalanche forecasters, as well as just kind of our wilderness first responders and even those who don't want to go be a responder but might find themselves in that situation. What we do is we were founded by Laura McGladrey. For those of you who have familiarity with her and her amazing work, she has been kind of leading the charge on developing tools and frameworks for a long time for how field responders can mitigate stress in themselves and in the people that they're with. So um, we're going to talk about a lot of the tools that we teach today, but really what we are at Responder Alliance is primarily a training center where we try to advance those best practices and make them accessible so that teams will actually go use them and we'll see better outcomes as a result. Everything we do is grounded in science, Laura being a scientist herself and researcher. We definitely do our best to make sure that everything can be grounded in like really good science and we actually know it's the most likely thing to work. I mean, nothing works 100% of the time in this world, and all of our best practices are designed to mitigate risk. This is another one. So let's see here, just a little bit about me. So yeah, my name's Griffin. I'm the director of Responder Alliance. I'm also the leader of the Lander Search and Rescue Resilience Team. So I really head up our resilience efforts, get to work with some really amazing folks out of Lander, Wyoming. We primarily end up working up in the Wind River Range. Outside of that, I'm also a wilderness medicine educator for Knowles and have kind of various background with brief stints guiding here and there and other things in kind of the climbing and outdoor industry. But that's primarily where I'm coming from today. So basically, what we're here really to announce is that there's a new partnership. This is the result of a lot of good discussions between Responder Alliance and the Mountain Rescue Association. Our goal is just to advance best practices and increase accessibility for our mountain rescue teams. As someone who's on a mountain rescue team that's all volunteer, we get it. Training and tools and all of these things, like it all costs money and we all have budgets to meet. And so one of our goals with this is to increase accessibility of this training for MRA members. So we do have some new resources that I'm going to share today. They'll be newer to some than to others, but we continue developing those. And then we do have discounted training from Responder Alliance that's now available to MRA members. And discounted team memberships as well for those who have resilience teams or peer support that want some additional structure and implementation support. So yeah, that's really, it's a pretty big announcement actually. I'm really stoked that MRA was excited to work with us on this. Um, so before we get to how we're going to be able to like access those things, I want to kind of start from just widest context, and then we can zoom into specifics. And your team doesn't have to go use those discounted training things. That you can come see me at the MRA conference. I'd be excited to hang, and Dean will be there. I know he's on this call too. And yeah, basically, either way, we're just trying to advance best practices and industry standards. And so, what we can do with these tools is one way to accomplish those goals. Oh, cool. Did someone draw a red line on the screen? I haven't seen that before. Basically, there are industry standards changing around this as we learn more. And that's how it always goes. We try something that we think is likely to work, and then it becomes a best practice. We start researching it more, figure out how well it's working, and hone our craft as we go. And so at this point, actually, people have been doing this for a long enough time in alpine rescue that ICAR, the actual International Commission of Alpine Rescue, has even established some guidelines and recommendations for best practices and how we mitigate stress. Um, I do want to lead with, I'm not an ICAR representative, and I am going to be speaking to these standards a little bit because not everyone knows about them. But what I would really encourage you all to do after this is actually go look up those recommendations, because they're easily accessible on the internet. You can just Google ICAR recommendations for stress resilience and alpine rescue, and from there, basically, there are a variety of ways you can tackle it, and I'm going to talk about one of those ways today, but there are others. Let me pull up the link here too so I can drop it in the chat. Oh, it's fighting with me. Okay. Cool. I'm just going to drop this in the chat, and then anyone who is looking can check them out as well. Justin, I don't know if you're able to figure out how to make that red line go away either.
I am working on it.
All right, sweet. So basically, with the ICAR standards, Responder Alliance's training is one way that you can go forward with that. There are other ways. The best practices, I'm going to run through what the recommendations are from ICAR in a minute, just so that y'all can see them. This is one way to go about it, but our real goal here is just to make sure that people aren't actually getting stress injured, or they're not getting traumatic stress injuries, they're not getting burnout from their work unnecessarily. We know that as mountain rescuers, sometimes we're exposed to heavy situations and real challenges that most people might never be exposed to, or only exposed to once. Sometimes we're out there on people's worst day of their life and we're like, wow, this is another day in the life for us. And as humans, we can expect that there will be impacts. Those things resonate with us and leave an impression, and that's good. It's proof that we're human. But there are best practices and things we can follow to make sure that we actually are still excited to go out on the next rescue as well. So yeah, that's one of the big shifts in industry standards actually is these international guidelines. It's really cool to have that from such a just large body that really, they've taken their time and done their homework on this, looked at the research. So it's really cool to see.
Griffin, not
Um,
sure if you noticed, but you stopped sharing.
oh, is it not sharing anymore?
Yeah, it
That
looks
is
like
weird.
the cutout.
Okay, thank you. I don't know what happened there.
And
All
the
right, are
red
you seeing
line
my
is
screen again
gone.
now?
Yeah, we got rid of the line.
All right. Well, yeah, maybe getting rid of the line was what did it. Um, okay, cool. Uh, so the other big shift in industry standards that we're seeing is a lot of new developments in psychological first aid, how we actually care for people who are experiencing distress or trauma. Um, and then incident support, really how we take care of our own. So both of these things are centered around pretty acute instances that have the potential to be traumatic. What we know is that even a really heavy mission where things go wrong or we don't get the outcome we want, it's not actually going to just mean that everyone's traumatized. None of us would be here if that was how it worked. We actually know that resilience and continuing to be passionate about our work and wanting to go do it again is the most common outcome. But we also know that not everyone is okay every time because we're human. So, psychological first aid is a really fundamental and basic skill set that anyone can give at any point to help mitigate the likelihood of traumatic stress formation. And when I use the term incident support, that's really how we can support our own teammates and those around us in the days, weeks, months, years that follow a really significant or potentially traumatic incident. So even if we don't get the outcome we're hoping for on a mission, it doesn't mean that we're all doomed to trauma, although it is possible, and we should recognize that someone might actually experience traumatic stress as a result. And if they do, what we can do is help them recover so that they still have their sense of community and mission and passion for what they do. And, they're hopefully ready and willing to come back and help out again in the future. I will say both of those things, like first aid and incident support, have been around for a while too. And so when I'm referring to those as changing industry standards, it's mostly just that, there continue to be new developments. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more as we go here. Okay. I'm not going to expect everyone to read all the words that are on the screen, but basically I wanted to run through briefly what the ICAR recommendations are because it's so helpful to have this from a governing body actually and be able to reference this. So again, these aren't Responder Alliance recommendations. We're a completely different organization. These are from ICAR. These are international guidelines and they're best practices. So basically, we want to break this down into preparing for a significant incident or mission, what we actually do during that mission, and then what happens afterwards. Because we know that traumatic stress typically forms around one really significant event. So if we know what to do before, during, and after that event, we're less likely to be injured as a result. So as far as pre-planning, if you look through these, it really is about understanding the fact that it is possible for there to be too much stress that injures us. This isn't that different from other injury types. And historically, people have talked a lot about mental health. But what we see with this actually is that it's closer to an injury than an illness oftentimes. That, we can get an overuse injury. If I'm out ground pounding in the hills, I can get overuse injuries and tendinitis in my legs because they're pushing the muscles too long, too far without any chance to recover. My nervous system can do the same thing. And if we get a really busy season, a couple of years ago, it was just fatality after fatality. That actually is taking a toll on our nervous systems because it's pushing harder and harder, just like any muscle, but it doesn't have time to recover in between. So we could get an overuse injury, could also get a traumatic injury. If my arm is bent too hard, too suddenly, if the bone is pushed at an odd angle really sharply, it might be too much for the bone to actually handle and it gets traumatic injury. The same again can be true of our nervous system. If it's just pushed too hard, too fast without time to accommodate, then we might develop a stress injury. Now, having that understanding and fundamentally knowing how to recognize when we're at risk of that is really the core of our pre-planning. And I firmly believe and advocate for this as a universal precaution for all of our field responders. At Lander Search and Rescue, this is part of our new member training that when we bring on new people, there's got to be fair warning in the same way that we don our PPE because we know that there are hazards that could exist if we get blood on ourselves, for example. We need to know that stress could injure us. So that's largely what this is about. It's understanding, it's regular training, not just once, but actually doing it regularly. Methods to promote resilience and connection. We know that connection within our teams is one of the great protective factors. We should be able to recognize potentially traumatic events, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. And then, honestly, like there's a lot of talk of resilience in our culture now because there's a lot of stressors. And the reality is there is no resilience if we don't get rid of the stressors that are unnecessary. So if we do have types of friction that are impacting our team or unnecessary conflict, we do have to address that rather than just expecting that people will be resilient on their own. As far as what we do during an incident, using the stress continuum is a recommendation. I'm going to come back to that in a minute here, but basically knowing how you show up, if you haven't slept in a month and you show up to do something really, really difficult, you can expect that you're more likely to get hurt doing it, right? And so, having that basic piece is very fundamental. Stress first aid or psychological first aid, or the Responder Alliance language, we use psychological first response for our training. There's all kinds of different terms for this, but it stems from very foundational research that these 5 principles of safety, calm, connection, efficacy, and hope actually do make us less likely to develop a stress injury if we can actually embody those principles during a stressful event. This is another one that we advocate for as a universal precaution, really. Like any rescuer should know how to help someone who's having the worst day of their life, because sometimes we wind up just sitting with the family and waiting. Maybe we're waiting for the ship to come in or for the clouds to clear. But if we don't know how to handle sitting with them, that actually leaves us at really high risk as well. And then finally, during the incident, having opportunities for people to opt out is really critical. It's not always realistic. Sometimes you can't just say, I'm out of here, this is too much. But it is a good thing to consider if we go from a rescue to a recovery, or we learn that, the subject is a child, the same age as one of our co-rescuers' child, or something like that that could make it hit close to home. And then there's what happens after the incident. And I'm going to come back to all of these with some practical recommendations, but I wanted to just start with what kind of the recommendations are in general, and then we'll go from there. So after the incident, if we're going to do debriefs, they should be timely and they should not re-traumatize the participants. Unfortunately, there is literature that some historic debriefings have re-traumatized people, and we want to avoid that by not forcing people to re-experience things that they don't want to. We should understand how stress injury recovery works in normal timing. I said the resilience is the most common outcome. That's a phrase that can't be said enough right now. It's okay to be okay. The 333 protocol I'm going to come back to, but it's a model for continuing to follow up with people after an event. And then finally, having a connection to mental health professionals, clinicians, therapists who actually speak your language and understand what it's like to go out there and try to save somebody. Okay, I'm not going to go too deep into science, I promise, but I do really like this slide and this image. So I think this is the only chart I have today, I promise. But this is something that every rescuer should actually understand. If we're going to be exposed to events that have the potential to traumatize us, we should know what our risk is. And fortunately, that can be relatively straightforward with basic education on it. So what this chart is showing is how people tend to fare after exposure to a really big, potentially traumatic event. This comes from George Bonanno's work. He's been studying trauma and resilience for a long time, including in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. So this research comes from very, very significant events and people who have been on the ground during those events. And basically what we see here is a timeline going horizontally, and then vertically, it's how much discomfort and distress we have. Are we able to sleep at night or not? Are we, fighting with our spouse when we weren't before? Do we just feel terrible all the time? All of those things would put us higher up on this chart. And what we see is that some people experience chronic stress after a really significant event, and there's a lot of variance, 5 to 30%. That's huge variability in how likely it is based on a variety of factors. But total, even worst case scenario, it would be about a third of people. Some people, it actually increases a bit over time. Not very many people have that, but some do. Most people either recover, so they start with a lot of distress, and then it improves gradually over time. and the vast majority of people actually don't experience that much distress to begin with, although they're generally very uncomfortable. It's not at the level of full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder. And those people tend to actually hold this line of resilience. And so in an untrained population, it's somewhere about 2/3 of people are expected to follow this resilience trajectory. And with more training, groups like military and potentially our rescuers who know what they're going into, that might be as high as like 85%. The reason I really like to start with this slide is that it shows us what our goal is. Why are we talking about this? It would be pointless to talk about trauma if there was nothing we could do about it. But there is something we can do about it. We can recognize that resilience is the most common outcome, and then we can recognize the few folks who aren't actually showing signs of being on that path, and we can give them more resources without pathologizing the health of the people who are doing okay. It's okay to be fine after a really significant event, but it's also it's okay if you're not. And so that's where we put resources where they're needed rather than just throwing them at the entire team. Okay, there's a lot of tools for this, and I'm going to run through some tools and best practices, and then I'm going to give a case study from my own experience in the Wind Rivers that I hope is helpful at illustrating how this can look when we put it all together. Once I've done that, what I want to do is actually give some time for questions so that we can talk about what this looks like in a team environment more specifically and how you can go forward with this. So many people are familiar with the stress continuum. I'm gonna have more time to talk about that in a minute here, but basically the broadest overview of the stress continuum is it's a tool that helps us name how we're feeling rather than just saying, oh, I'm fine or I am not okay. It gives us a little more nuance. I can say, I'm kind of getting in the orange today if I feel like, wow, I'm having physical symptoms show up from how much stress I'm under, and I'm having sleep issues. Those might be red flags that, oh, I'm pushing into the orange. But then when those issues start going away and I'm sleeping well again, not perfect. Maybe I'm getting back into the yellow though. That's a sign that I'm recovering. Basically, it's like our vital signs. It's not about where you're at, it's about where you're trending. So you might have a resting heart rate of 60 because you're, crazy cool mountain rescuer who meditates for 2 hours a day. Or you might have a resting heart rate of 95. And it's fine either way. What matters more is your heart rate going up while you're sitting at rest? Because if it is, I'm starting to get concerned about your health. But if it's calming down now that you're sitting down, okay, good. That's kind of what we want to see here too. If we're actually trending towards red, even when things don't seem to be going wrong, that's cause to ask more questions. But if we're trending towards green, we don't actually have to be there. We know we're headed in the right direction. A couple other tools here. These are things more from the Responder Alliance curriculum, but basically they're just more tools to help us structure our resilience planning. So if we recognize that we're not doing so good, or we have anticipated big stressors, and those anticipated big stressors might be, hey, it's spring and summer is our busiest time of year for rescues. So something significant could happen anytime, or it might be a really relentless summer. I don't know. They're just more tools to help us structure our lives to get in the green or get closer to the green or wherever we need to be, because that's going to mean that we have more room to handle the additional stress that could come. Basically, this is our pre-planning. So as we're preparing for an incident, this is kind of what we want to start with. Give people fair warning and tools so that they know what to do if they start feeling impacted. Let's see. One other thing I want to name on the stress continuum is this sense on the right, or on the green near the bottom, this section of room for complexity. It's a really kind of fuzzy concept, but basically the closer we get towards red, the more our brain is in survival mode, looking for threats and any way that we can survive them, any way we can avoid them. And when our brain is busy doing that, it's doing a really great job. It's adaptive. It's, it says, hey, this might be like a war zone, right? I need to watch out for danger. But if we're not in a war zone and we're spending all our energy watching for danger, what do we have less energy for? All the complexity that goes into mission planning or briefing or packing or building that anchor that we're going to rely on. And that doesn't mean that people who aren't in the green shouldn't be allowed to help out on missions. They absolutely should. But there's also this sense that if I show up completely exhausted, I should at least be aware that I'm completely exhausted. Because I might just tell my partner, hey, just so you know, I have not slept more than 4 hours in the last week, and I'm going to do everything I can here to make sure that I'm helping, but someone needs to check my anchor. Someone needs to check my knot. That is okay. This is just dynamic risk management that we haven't always had before. So having more language and tools for those type of things actually does protect us too. We just have to know what we're talking about, and we have to speak the same language as one another. When we get to during the mission, there's a variety of things we can do, but really what we teach at Responder Alliance mostly focuses on psychological first aid, psychological first response. The reason for that is twofold. One is that when we're on scene and we have bystanders who are causing a ruckus or screaming or staring off into the distance, or we have the subject's family members who are asking for more and more and more information, and we just don't even know what's going on yet. Those are actually people who are at risk of stress injury. And as medical professionals and rescuers, we should be concerned about their long-term outcomes because our actions can improve their outcomes. And that's really important. That's something that we want to do. So the ability to give psych first aid and the training and know how to actually use that in the field when it starts raining or, the situation changes, new information comes in, that is really important to improve patient outcomes. The kind of hidden second half of this, though, the other side of the coin, is that psychological first aid knowledge is protective for us as rescuers. We consistently hear that the most stressful part of the mission for rescuers tends to be when we're sitting with the subject's family or when we're, at the SAR barn or the cache or wherever, and people are asking questions and they just want more information and we don't know how to talk to them. Or in particular, if we're watching someone acutely grieve or experience trauma, that's painful to us. And that's, again, proof that we're human. But the ability to know how to help them work through that, and it doesn't mean we fix everything, but we at least give them something and know that what we're saying and what we're doing, how we're carrying ourselves, is what they need at that moment, that can go a long ways. This after incident support image on the front, actually, this is one of the newest developments. This is just kind of fresh, hot off the presses here, but basically it's our next step for these folks who, maybe they are just giving that 1,000-mile stare and we're genuinely concerned that they might experience traumatic stress formation. How do we help them after they leave? The rescuers don't go home with them. We don't go to the hotel where they're waiting for information. But what we can do is sit down with them and do a bit of documentation that's based on those key principles of psychological first aid to help structure their next steps so they know what to expect. And maybe they can't even read it at the moment we hand it to them, but maybe a couple hours later when they're sitting and everything is quiet, they look at what's in their hand and it reminds them that they're safe and they survived. Okay, this is getting from during the incident to what happens after the incident now. The ICAR recommendations do include recognizing when there's a potentially traumatic event, and that's, sometimes it's easier than others. If we are doing a recovery of one of our own on our own team, that's pretty obvious that that is likely to hit close to home. But what if it's pretty standard mission and things went pretty well and okay, sure, it was a kid with a broken arm, but it all seems fine. but there's a brand new member and they've never experienced anything like this before. They've never seen a disfigured limb, and it's something bad that happened to a child. And now, that actually has some possibility of sticking with them. They might feel terrible after that, and that could be totally normal and anticipated. The fact is that traumatic stress is actually an exposure hazard, similar to carbon monoxide poisoning in a tent, or getting a needle stick if we're moving medical waste. That if we're exposed to it, it doesn't mean that we'll get hurt, but it means we could. And so recognizing when there's a high risk exposure tells us that we should be watching and paying attention so that we can react if necessary. Basically, what this incident support tool does is it helps break that down for us so that we can recognize common potentially traumatic events and kind of calculate a score with some measure of objectivity that tells us what each individual rescuer is going through during the incident and what they were exposed to. And that doesn't mean that they're going to be injured or not based on their score, but it does give us some hint of, who should we be checking in with. I'm not going to go through what all of these mean. There's separate training on these topics that I would really encourage folks to get. But being able to, whether it's with this tool or something else, being able to appraise and measure our exposure to these things immediately at the end of the incident is really fundamental, because if we don't know that someone was exposed to something, how are we supposed to help them? All right, so at this point, we're getting into what do we do with folks who had a high risk exposure or are otherwise not doing well. And the 333 protocol is something that is specifically named actually in the ICAR guidelines, and this is part of our incident support training. But basically, our goal with this is monitoring and mitigation. So most people are fine, and if they are, then we might check in with them 3 days after a really significant mission, and they say, "I'm all good," and we say, "Great, I'm so glad to hear it." But they might say, "I'm still really shaken up. I'm not sleeping well. I'm thinking about it a lot. Let's just check in again in a couple weeks." And so this allows us to structure it so that we know what to do and what to say 3 days, 3 weeks, and 3 months after the incident. And that just makes sure that no one suffers in silence. What we know about our rescuers is that they're such others before self people. And if we don't give structure and say, this is how we're going to do this, they might just not complain. And the reality is, your average rescuer who develops PTSD, they suffer in silence for a really long time. It takes an average of 18 to 21 months before they seek help. And that's 18 to 21 months of suffering when they could have been receiving help right away. It's also 18 to 21 months where their brain is forming new habits and connections. And those things then take time to rewrite. And if we can correct that curve right away by noticing, hey, 3 weeks later, you're still not doing so good, let's just nip this in the bud. Let's be proactive. Those things can make a difference long term. And this could be the difference of keeping someone in their career. I've already heard that from a member of Lander Search and Rescue, that they wouldn't still be on our team if it wasn't for the 333 that they received after a really significant mission. And I'm really glad she's still on our team, because we certainly rely on her. The last piece of the ICAR guidelines is having mental health professionals who speak rescuer. And I think there's probably no shortage of us in this call who've had the experience of the opposite of this, where you talk to someone and say, hey, I'm not doing so hot, and they're like, yeah, but why do you go into the mountains? Isn't that kind of childish? Or like, oh, maybe you have like a rescuer complex or something. And that, it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what we do and why we do it. And those things may be well-meaning, but they actually can be harmful. And it might be something less strong than that. It might just be that they totally don't understand what you mean when you say, well, my 3-week check-in, my TSQ is 8. So the clinician hub that we have at Responder Alliance is one way of trying to address that, where Laura actually trains other clinicians and mental health professionals on these same tools and languages so that they can basically speak rescuer. And if someone from your team needs to go talk to a therapist after a significant mission, they don't have to spend their first session or two describing what they do and what tools they use in their language. Again, it's one way of meeting that. There are a lot of clinicians out there who are interested in working with responders, so this is one way among many of meeting that, but it's worth thinking about before it comes up. Okay. I just want to pause and say thanks everyone for bearing with me. I just talked so much theory in nonstop monologue. Before I give an example and kind of a case study here, are there any burning questions that someone is really itching to get off their chest or wondering about? Because I really did just run through quite a bit of information there, and I totally recognize that. Nothing? Cool. I am going to hold more time for questions at the end. Basically, all of this theory exists to help our rescuers want to keep doing what they do. Because one of the most really common and early signs of a stress injury in formation would be that we get pinged to go on a rescue and we go, oh God, I don't want to do this. Rather than having that moment that we had early in our careers where we're like, whoa, oh my God, this is really happening. Cool. Cool. I'm going to go help someone. And it's possible to hold on to that experience and think about the people we're helping and care about them and want to do it long into our careers. But we do have to protect that part of us that cares, and this is how we do it. So, or this is one way that we can do it, rather. So, this is one story specifically where I can run through kind of a lot of those tools in practice. I think a lot of us have these stories, and I'm not going to belabor it too much, but I think it's helpful to have an example that kind of just hits some of the key points to be able to identify what we're doing and why. So this story is from Search in the Wind Rivers. Basically, we got pinged to an inReach SOS, and we had no other information. Not really messaging back and forth, pretty much nothing. All we had was an SOS from the Circular Towers. So, a handful of us got flown out there, and we, got to the GPS point, located the reporting party, and what we found was a fairly complicated situation. We were really just the hasty squad to go gather information, and what we found was a family that was on vacation with a pretty significant language barrier and some communication challenges as a result. And a member of their party had gone missing after going up ahead to free solo a climb and had not returned from free soloing that the evening prior. So they were very distraught at this point. It was, midday-ish, and very significant walls in the Circular Towers for anyone who hasn't been up there before. It's not an area to be taken terribly lightly. And at the same time, we have no clue. They're very likely on the wall. A bit of background, we had started our resilience team not that long prior, but we had been doing a good amount of training for lander search and rescue and really just introducing more and more of these resilience tools. And so most of our team that were out there were 4 of us, I think we're showing up pretty solidly in the green on the stress continuum. And we were feeling pretty good. And then, we kind of got this information and it was just like, well, shoot, that's not what we were really hoping for with this SOS beacon, but okay, let's go look. So we start searching, and you can see in this picture, we're getting up into some alpine terrain, a little bit of clouds showing up, and we searched along the most likely places, the ascent route, descent route, and we weren't having a ton of luck. We found a couple signs, but nothing very definitive. From there, the clouds started to grow and we started to hear thunder, so we had to really hustle it back down out of the alpine and get to camp. And this was, not our preferred way to spend the afternoon, and definitely not for the family either, as the storm really started to hit and turn to hail, and we know that we very likely have a climber stuck above tree line, and there's not really any shelter on the route that this climber was on. So, we're kind of just pinned down watching this. And I should say that we had like the best team we could have asked for. We had a climber who'd put up first descents all over the place out there. We had an ER doc. We had a military guy with tons of search experience. It was really a good team. And we're just sitting in this tent watching this huge hail fall and knowing that the family is just, a little ways away watching the same thing happen. And at this point, we're feeling really hopeless and really helpless and really stuck. There's nothing we can do. This is the feeling that is often described when traumatic stress is in formation. We feel alone, we feel helpless. One other big factor could be personal identification. If, for example, one of us was getting ready to go climb the route that this climber was on, which I was, and I had friends flying in to climb the same route 2 weeks later, these things start adding up and you start not feeling so good. Fortunately, the next day dawned gorgeous. And we got out there, we made great time, and we did find that the climber had fallen and was deceased, and called in some help, had a successful recovery, and got the family out of there. And it wound up being a good rest of the mission. It was a lot of really intensive psychological first aid as we worked with the family to process this information and then hike the 14 miles out. But we did it. We felt good, and we got home. Now, the question is raised, is this traumatic? And, I named a couple factors that like maybe it could be kind of. And so what's helpful is having the structure in place to go beyond just that question of, am I okay, am I not okay? But to ask like, what's actually happening here? So I got back and we all got back and we all filled out our incident support tools. This is my incident support tool for this mission. Pretty heavy personal identification in particular, a lot of exposure to the family members, and I was getting ready to climb the same route. My brain is saying, this could have been you. Like this was very close to being you. And that is what a healthy brain would do when presented with information that seems like it could save your life. So, pretty heavy there. A lot of family contact, not much novel exposure, but a little bit. We kind of go down the list. There was actually a good amount of stressors, and I scored right in the middle, 50. The highest score possible would be 100. So, pretty moderate exposure. The question is, was I traumatized by this? And the answer is no. This was a moderate exposure. A couple days later, I wasn't feeling the best. And then, by the time a week had gone by, I was mostly recovered. And the same was true for the rest of our rescuers, despite a pretty moderate exposure. But the thing is, we got back and we had a discussion about that exposure. We sat down and filled out our tools and talked about it. We talked about the things we had trained on just, in the weeks prior. And having the structure in place actually does a great job of reinforcing safety. That combined with the fact that we are naturally pretty resilient, it actually can make a difference. So that's one example of how some pre-mission prep, using psych first aid during the mission, pretty extensively, we saw improvements in the family members, which was really rewarding for us actually. And then following up afterwards, it gives us more structure, and structure is what the brain craves when it feels threatened. All right, there's not a whole ton here for new developments. I want to highlight this psychological first aid piece a little bit more. This paperwork is really new, actually, that we have these as like notepads that you could just tear one of these off, and it's two-sided, and you would just fill it out with the patient and send it home with them. This is actually a great new development. I definitely wish I had had this when I was, running ambulance too. But the ability to send them home with something is a lot better than kind of what often historically has happened of just, we're hoping for the best for you. And on the back side of it, it actually has a lot of structure. Obviously, I don't expect anyone to read all these words, but not on a Zoom call. But basically, we're trying to structure things for our rescuers. So we have a couple example phone calls of how we might handle a really difficult call, and then a lot of structure that reinforces safety and psychological first aid for people when they're at home and maybe more ready to receive that. So this is one big new development. The other big one that's in the works is just kind of more structure for how we put all the pieces together with that before, during, and after. And so there's more info to come in the future on kind of the wider framework that all this fits into. All right, I've been talking a lot. I'm going to wrap up here in a few minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. I'm leaving quite a lot of time for questions, and if folks have them, great. If they don't, then that's also fine. But yeah, I did want to make sure that I left plenty of time there for that. Um, so, really at this point, stress injury education, we fundamentally believe this is a universal precaution for mountain rescue. We all should have a right to fair warning on these things. And as new members are signing up, some of the old guard might not want to hear it, but as new members are signing up, it's okay to introduce this as the industry standard, that you should be aware of how these things work because it's another risk that you're exposed to. And the fact is, this might actually be the most likely injury type to lead you to leave your career as a rescuer. You might just not want to do it anymore if the stress gets to be too much. But there's hope in that. If we know what we're talking about, then we have some power over it. Um, the really exciting piece that's kind of brought me here today is partnership between the MRA and Responder Alliance. We're offering a discount on training for MRA teams and members. So you can go to responderalliance.com/MRA for more information on that. That discount applies to both our online training courses, of which there are 4 of them, and we would recommend starting with the more introductory ones. The webpage has info on that. And it also applies to team memberships, which some teams, have a resilience team structure like we have here in Lander, or a peer support structure, or there's the grit team down in central Colorado. Like there's all kinds of different ways we can structure this and name it. But basically, how do we have some people who are dedicated to making sure this stuff happens? And so we have team memberships to help give structure and support to those people, because what we know is that if every one rescuer just goes and gets the training and doesn't talk to other people about it, the dial doesn't move very much. But if we train as a team and structure how we're going to apply these tools, we can change our operations into something that's less likely to result in rescuers getting hurt. So those are resources that are available. You can also totally email me if you have questions or want to talk more about how this looks. I'm really fortunate to get to work with a lot of resilience teams, and not just in mountain rescue, but a good amount of mountain rescue units that are using these things. I'm totally here as a resource for you too, and I can help point you in the direction of other people who are doing cool work as well. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I also do know a lot of other cool rescuers who are kind of pushing the dial forward on this stuff. Um, that's all I've got for you. What questions do folks have?
I have a couple of questions if no one else does. I've got kind of a one kind of just clarification one, something I caught in the slide, and then a little bit more complicated one, I guess. So I did notice in the incident support tool, there was a difference between consider, it said follow up gathering, and for the red it had follow up social gathering, and I was curious what the difference between the two were.
Yeah, I think having not been the person who wrote those words down, I'm going to do my best here.
Yeah.
But really, the fundamental piece actually is more so about that consider versus just moving forward.
Yeah. Okay.
So, after a mission where my personal exposure as one individual rescuer was in the yellow, it's time for me to ask myself how I'm doing and how I'm feeling about it. And, a yellow exposure for someone who has been through it time and again, and they say, look, I'm good. This didn't hit me that hard, is one thing. But when we see that same yellow exposure for a new member or someone who's, maybe never seen a dead body before, or someone who's got a kid the same age as the subject, those are things that would start ringing alarm bells for us that, this, let's just check in on Jim and see how he's doing. Um, but as far as the like gathering, social gathering, how we're going to do it, it's there's a lot of different opinions on gatherings and debriefings and diffusings and things, and that tends to go beyond the Responder Alliance curriculum, so I'm not going to go way into it. But what I can say is this: our sense of social connectedness is our greatest protecting factor. If we know that our people in our community, on our team that we care about and we've been to hell and back with, are there with us, we're actually more likely to be okay. So, whether we consider that or just make it happen, it kind of just depends on the situation. That's definitely how we handle it on my team. But yeah, I mean, does that answer your question well enough?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good answer. I think there's obviously like a lot of nuance to some of this training, and it is a broad overview. But I do think that answers the question.
Cool. You said you had one more?
Yeah, so this is the one. As I kind of I listened through this, and most of the people on the call have some experience, some of us quite a bit of experience with psychological first aid training. And one of the things I see about Responder Alliance is it's not just like, hey, here's this training that you can go get to, better yourself. It's more about equipping teams to have a program to deal with these things, right? Like these are tools that you should have in your toolbox to begin with. You shouldn't have to be going to the Spawner Alliance for every incident, right? You're training, not training trainers, but you're equipping teams with these tools. And something that I think like permeates through search and rescue in just about any discipline, this included, is that apathy or resistance or resilience from teams that have uh, older members or largely, masculine male members that just have a certain predisposition towards not thinking that there's value in this stuff. And that's just from my experience, and it's maybe a personal opinion, but it's something that I see. And I'm just curious if you have dealt with that, or if you've thought through, or Responder Alliance has thought through, like, what are the ways that you can approach some of these teams where I feel like people will see this and they'll say, this would be great if my team did this, but I know if I bring it up, it's going to get shut down. And I'm just curious if that's something that you guys have thought about, like how do you approach that with those situations?
Yeah, I'm out here in cowboy country, Justin. I'm in the dead center of the least populated state in the US. We still have a horse rescue team that, if we can't fly, we ride. And like, it's, I thought that was going to be such a huge challenge when I still remember making my little presentation for the team, but that like, hey, I really want to start a resilience team, you guys, and thinking I was going to get so much resistance. And there was one guy who was pretty opposed to it. And that was it. I presented this to like probably 40 people at our team meeting. And the reality is from there, we in the Wyoming Department of Health hired us to train teams statewide, including law enforcement. And I mean, if the cowboy cops out here are willing to adopt this stuff, I'm suddenly a lot less worried about the grizzled old rescuer who has seen people burn out left and right, because in my experience, that person tends to say, I want this so that other people don't have to go through what I saw people go through. And that's not everyone. But I think I've heard that phrase more often than I've heard, hey, we don't need this, we're fine. So I would encourage people to try. If you hit resistance, work with it, you know. Um, but the resistance tends to be less than I would have expected.
Great. That's a good answer. Yeah, it's kind of what you want to hear, right? But I know that that question comes up across disciplines in rescue, right? Whether it's changing whatever your descent control device is to, building a resilience team, right? So thank you.
Totally. And if it doesn't work for your team, don't do it. Like, if you try this and it's not working or it's making things worse, try something else. Like,
Yeah.
but what we know about trauma in particular is that a toolkit approach, and this is more pulling from Bonanno's work, the guy who did that chart, a toolkit approach is actually what we need. And the crux move is having enough tools, but not just that. It's having the knowledge and self awareness to say, what I'm trying isn't working. I'm going to try something else. And if we can pull that move off, we can get through it. But if we lose the ability to change what tool we're trying to use in a situation where it's not working, that's where trauma is more likely to form. So this is a toolkit. I encourage people to train on others too. Look up the research for yourself if you're so inclined. There's a lot of it out there, and it's really cool.
What worked really well for us was to start with just education and, tell them flat out, this is not a bunch of psychobabble. This is first aid. It's like, putting a Band-Aid on a cut or splinting an arm. It's not trauma surgeon level psychology. This is stuff that you, me, and the guy next to you can do. And, just start with the basics and let them know that, this is not rocket science. It's simple stuff, and give them a context to appreciate it in so that they think, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And essentially take the arguments away from them before they even start and let them know that it's actually a useful tool.
Yeah, great answer, Art.
Yeah, thanks, Art. I will say to that too, starting with psychological first aid before talking about the stress continuum and protecting ourselves sometimes lands better for rescuers because there's so others before self that they're willing to try something if they think it'll improve patient outcomes, but they might be less eager to have a conversation about protecting themselves.
I would also add that some validation from other organizations. I'm super excited, Griffin, about the MRA partnership. And speaking now as the Air Rescue Commission president for ICAR, we just had 2 days of board meetings that just finished today, and Responder Alliance was a significant part of the conversation. The medical commission is so much behind that. The MRA is now behind it. So to tell your local authorities, look, it's happening at an international and national level. We got to make sure it happens at a local level. Is, I think, pretty compelling. I mean, there's so much validation now between ICAR and the MRA, and congratulations to you folks at Responder Alliance for making it happen, and to you, Griffin, especially.
Thanks, Charlie. I feel like you've made an awful lot happen on this stuff that, yeah, but
You just introduce somebody to a concept like this, and it has its own legs. I haven't had to work hard because, although I've flown with 5 pilots who've died in service, and so I more than anyone understand Responder Alliance. I don't have to do a lot of convincing. It sort of speaks for itself, as you've done so beautifully in the last hour.
thanks, Charlie. What other questions are out there? I know they're floating around.
Oh, hi, I'm Lauren. I'm on Tier Madre. I just had a question. We've implemented a 333 on our team. I'm sure you've heard about it. Do you have any recommendations on the best way to follow up? I find that we have a sad op that has like a unfortunate outcome, and we're good about like this 3 day, maybe the 3 week, and by 3 months 2 more ops has happened, and we're having a hard time keeping track of everything. We have an Excel spreadsheet, but I still find that I open to suggestions, and I want to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I love the question. It comes up fairly often, and I'm excited to hear what other folks on the call have from experience as well, because it varies widely in my experience. On my team, we use Google Calendar, and we have reminder notifications, and we don't tend to forget. Excel spreadsheets can get really crazy if you have a busy season. Um, I mean, if it's busy enough, I'm sure Google Calendar will too. But the key with the 3 month check-in is mostly saying we're still thinking about you. It's not um, it's not about hitting it on the exact day, but it is making sure that the person isn't forgotten. One other piece that I would definitely suggest on this, if your team is using the 333 but not the incident support tool, you're really only using half of the post-incident framework there. But 333s for everyone who's exposed to an incident are going to be very overwhelming very quickly. And that's really where that exposure appraisal piece comes in handy, because most people, most of the time, have a low enough risk exposure that if they measure it out and you ask them, they'll actually probably say, maybe check in with me in 3 days, but I think I'm going to be fine. So letting people opt out is also key. It's not, mandatory forced check-ins or anything, which I doubt that, most of us do it as like a forced scripted thing, but it's still worth saying. So yeah, I would say, you know, those are a couple things that could help, but I'm curious if anyone else on the call has other experience or tools that they want to share.
Yeah, I'm one of Lauren's teammates, and the situation we had last season was, we'd have a fatality and a recovery, and then before the 3 months is up, we'd have another one, and there'd be a different group of people that played a key role in that one, but there'd be some overlap. So you have somebody that's on the 333 from the first one, and now they're on the next 333. So do you do a 666 with them, or do you let the second one, dominate the calendar and forget about the first exposure? Or, yeah, that's the sort of conundrum that Lauren and I ran into.
The first time that anyone on one of these calls has ever said 666, but not language you usually use around here. Yeah,
Might not
no,
be the last. You never know.
it's in my experience, the key part is making sure that people know that they're cared about and supported, and they still have access to their community. So if they are going on more missions, they might not need that last 3 month check-in because they still are accessing their community. It's also possible that they still really want that 3 month check-in. I think being dynamic and flexible is key here, but also giving room for people who are doing okay to exit that. We don't pathologize healthy responses ever. If someone's doing fine, that means they're exhibiting the most common outcome. And we want to encourage that and encourage, whatever green looks like for them. If that's meditating in the mornings or going fly fishing or, rock climbing on the weekends, whatever green looks like for them, if they're doing okay, then that's actually probably what they need more than anything else. And that 3 month check-in for me oftentimes is like, hey, let's go walk the dogs together or something like that, where it's actually a built-in green choice. So it's one more thing to consider anyway. Other thoughts folks have on this one?
I think it can be as simple sometimes as just sending somebody a text message. It doesn't have to be prescribed like 333, but just, hey, Rick, thinking about you. I'm around this weekend if you want to chat. Leave it at that. And, if Rick calls, great. But at a minimum, Rick knows he's being thought about.
Something
I mentioned earlier that we just brought on all these new members And their first mission, for those who could respond, was the broken ankle on a mountain bike trail. Easy. And I was talking at helicopter training on Wednesday, last night, to a guy in the team, saying, I'm glad they had a simple one. My first one was a teenager who fell off a cliff to his death. And I mentioned it to one of our other veterans. He said, yeah, my first one was a suicide, and I was the guy who found him. And I just put my arms around him and I just said, give me a hug. And I gave him a big hug. That mission was 20 years ago. But I was like, just giving him that hug and saying, man, I'm here if you ever want to talk about it. And he was like, thanks. I think I'm good, but thanks. It doesn't have to follow the 3-3-3 regimen. It can just be texting that person to just say, hey, been thinking about you. I'm around this weekend if you ever want to chat. And that little love bomb, is, I think, supportive as well.
Agreed. I do want to add one thing there. Sometimes we'll refer to a 333 as a now, later, and much later. If someone expects you to follow up with them on a certain day or at a certain time because you told them that you would, you should really do that. That is one thing to like absolutely avoid, is telling someone you're going to follow up and then missing the date or something. So whatever reminder you have to set. But if you haven't promised anything beyond I'm going to check in with you in a couple months, just make sure you check in with them in a couple of months. I will say with this too, like the 333, and I mentioned, the incident support tool is also part of this. This is a topic that it's worth getting training on. Like all responders who are going to be using these tools should be properly trained on them first. And so, it can't just be an expectation that people can figure this out and improvise how to help people any more than they can with psych first aid. But if you want to learn more about this, I am presenting on the incident support framework, what happens after an incident, at the MRA conference next month too. So like, hopefully I'll see some of you all there. Come hang out with me. It'll be fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we've utilized that tool before. I don't think we have. Art, do you know?
Yeah, I use it, as a rough script, just to, get the other person talking about it a little bit. Not trying to be like the Spanish Inquisition to force them to talk, but you ask them a question and they'll answer it in either 2 words, or they'll just start talking and feel comfortable with letting things out of their system. But yeah, I find it's useful, and there's a copy of it in my mailbox at the station if you need to grab one.
What other questions are floating around out there?
Yeah, I have a current 333 assignment. Yeah, 3 days. Subject, my team member said, yeah, I want to talk about that. It's bothered me. It was his first mission with us, and it was a body recovery. At 3 weeks, I called him, he didn't return the call, and I thought, this is a really good sign. It's completely voluntary. He doesn't have to do this. He must be doing okay. And 3 months is coming up 5 days from now. I will call him again or try to see him, but I think he's okay. Does that work?
I think it would be situational. Not knowing this person, I can't tell you if that works or not. I will say, a common thing with stress injury is that people stop showing up. So it would be worth continuing to follow up with some awareness of that. But we don't want to drive people crazy. I mean, 333s are voluntary. It's the whole thing of like no mandatory re-experiencing, no required re-traumatization of the event. But yeah, not knowing the person, I mean, Dean, you've been at this a long time. I definitely trust your judgment with your team.
Dean, one of the bits of feedback we got when we first started doing 333s was that people felt like when we did the 3-week follow-up that they were being surprised by it and getting caught off guard. So what we started doing is scheduling the second 3 and the last 3, so that it's something that, they know it's coming, they can be prepared for it, not just, schedule wise, but, emotionally, that, there's going to be somebody giving them a call to talk about this thing. And not springing it on them unexpectedly decreases their stress level. Or at least that's the feedback we've gotten.
That's a good idea.
Depending on their age and their mode of communication, I think the younger generation communicates via text message, and getting a random phone call it kind of catches them off guard. Some people prefer phone calls other than text messages. Some people prefer text messages. So I think it depends on the person.
I totally agree with Lauren, having
Yeah.
daughters who are at that age where if I want to really connect with them, it's going to be by text, not springing a phone call on them. And also, I'd be curious, Griffin, whether even saying, "Hey, it's been 3 months. You popped up on my calendar. I'm calling you," versus, "Hey, just checking in," and not having to assign it to some Responder Alliance protocol, as opposed to, "Hey, just checking in," and as Lauren just said, checking in by whatever is the mode of communication most commonly used.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I really like personally, and this is not speaking from just Responder Alliance curriculum, but personally, what I really like for a 3 month check-in is to actually see them face to face, whether it's having, a coffee or going for a hike or something. And it frankly usually has nothing to do with anything pathological because we're usually fine and feeling pretty well at that point. That's, what's nice about that is that some of my great moments with teammates have been over coffee now, where I wouldn't have had coffee with them otherwise. And if they're still not doing okay, then that is a really good moment to just say like, hey, there are more resources available. If you're still feeling it at 3 months out, then here's, let's talk about next steps for you. But I mean, then your worst case scenario is like, okay, cool, you went out for a coffee with your friend, great. And that I do schedule with them. I don't just show up at their door with coffee. I'll text them and um, yeah.
Okay, well, I'll try the coffee invitation or the contact by text. I'm an old guy who grew up with phone calls, not text.
Yeah, I'm with you, Dean. Phone call better.
Yeah, but listen to the younger generation. If that's not how they communicate, then
Oh,
you
absolutely. Yeah.
you might be
Communicate by the
pressing
mean.
for a communication style that's not their MO.
The stressed
Um,
brain craves structure.
Yeah.
It wants things to be predictable. It wants to know what's going to happen. And if predictable for you means getting a cold call on your phone from your friends, that's great. That's awesome. That's exactly what you want. If predictable for you means that a phone call equals an emergency, but a text message equals like, hey, let's hang out, then okay, let's text if we're gonna hang out. So it's somewhat just, you can do a buddy system or whatever makes sense for people to follow up in a way that's more expected and structured for the person receiving it too.
Yeah. It's all about the recipient.
Other questions on anything? I mean, this isn't a 333 training. I would definitely defer to, this isn't just going to be that, but other questions on any pieces of how this fits together or anything? Cool. Well, I really appreciate everyone coming out. I'm gonna back it up. Yeah, so if anyone does have other questions, and anyone watching the recording too, you can email me, griffin@responderalliance.com. I'm here as a resource for you, and so are others on my team. Yeah, really fortunate to get to work with so many cool teams out there, and it just keeps growing. We just hired another person to help out too. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining. This was great.
Griffin, I'm so sorry to do this. I've been driving and I haven't wanted to turn on my video. Can I ask a really quick question? Sorry.
No. Yes, go for it.
Feel free to leave, everyone. I'm on Deschutes County Search and Rescue,
Yeah.
and my question is, sorry, I'm picking up a daughter from the gym, just 2 seconds. Are there things you can do on like at the mission or on scene, particularly if it's a recovery where time is not of the essence, are there things you can do as a team to assuage any future injury? One thing that I've done when I'm leading a recovery is just like a moment of silence for the team to just kind of respect and honor what you're doing. And but I'm just wondering if there's any other things like that that you've found work on your teams or on rescues that you've done, particularly recoveries. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I think the moment of silence is great. It's very respectful. It's structured in a way that, people hear, oh, we're doing a moment of silence, and their brain recognizes that and says, thank God someone thought of this. Thank God I'm not the first person ever to encounter a dead body. Because especially if it's a novel exposure where they've never seen this before, that's going to be where their brain goes at first is, I'm doing something wrong. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what to expect. I must not be safe right now. And what reinforcing rituals in those kind of sacred moments does is it tells us a lot of people have been through this before and it feels terrible every time. And that's why we've set aside this moment to just honor that it sucks and that we cared about this person and wanted it to go differently. Beyond that, I would just say psychological first aid. I mean, it's those key principles of safety, calm, connection, efficacy, and hope. I mean, there's always hope. We can always reinforce safety or remove evidence of danger. Those things do make a difference very fundamentally. So that's what I defer to time and again on this stuff. But the collective experience, or we use the term like wisdom quotient sometimes, like on this call, is so far beyond mine. Like, do people have other things that you have experienced that work really well?
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, but in similar situations where that you either are or are likely to go into what could potentially be a traumatic experience, sometimes it's as simple as like that person in charge just saying that thing out loud, like, "Hey guys, like this is something you're about to experience. This is something we're going into. Like, how is everybody doing? Have you experienced this before?" And just opening or cracking that door open to start having that conversation, from someone with more experience or your team leads can at least just start nudging people in the right direction and make that space for people to kind of respond to that situation.
Yeah, and also the obvious thing that Griffin mentioned early on is just make it optional. If you're not up for it right now because your head's not in the right place, it's like, okay, hang back at the CP.
I think too on that, make it optional or provide other tasks that allow the person to still be helpful and useful, but that aren't, creating like direct exposure.
Yes, yes, yes. Can I like say yes 100 times? Like, so that's efficacy. It's a part of psych first aid is getting people involved in whatever capacity makes sense. And this is why we don't kick people out from a rescue if they show up in the red either. Instead, we have them bring pizza to the other rescuers because everyone's happy to see them and they're not worried that they're going to make a mistake even though they're exhausted. Self-efficacy, the ability to help and contribute, is a protective factor in a potentially traumatic event. So, yes to that 1,000 times over. It's like, yeah, you hit it perfectly. One more thought on this that came up in an earlier conversation today, actually, is that if you do have, the ER doc or the trauma surgeon or the person who's been at it for 40 years and seen everything under the sun, and they can look to the team when it turns out that the rescue had to turn into a recovery, if they can turn to the rest of the team and say, there's nothing I could have done different. We did everything right. And sometimes we get a bad outcome. That actually can make a difference too. Stress injury can be characterized by feelings of guilt or shame that we feel like we should have done things differently. And when you can get someone with a position of authority, in a medical director role or something, who can actually say that to the team, that might also be protective.
That's a great point.
We are just about at time, my friends. I can totally do another question though, if anyone else has um, got one lingering. Now's a good moment. Cool. Thank you all for coming out. This was really fun. I appreciate just getting to spend a little bit of my evening with you all and hear different people's experiences and thoughts on this. Please do reach out, and if you want to access the training discount from the partnership, it's just responderalliance.com/MRA. But feel free to reach out. We have free community meetings too. I know a bunch of people on this call have already been on those, but yeah, you can join our platform for free and then add them to your calendar, and we just keep these conversations rolling on there, and there's a lot of collective wisdom to learn from. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Griffin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Griffin.
Yeah, that was excellent. I appreciate everybody calling in and supporting Responder Alliance, and I really look forward to getting more information out to the rest of the MRA about this, because we'll post this online and try and get more people to come back and watch this, because this is an excellent tool for our teams. So I really appreciate it, Griffin.
For sure. More resources to come too. This is the first part of the partnership, but we got
Awesome.
more coming. Otherwise, just come hang with me at MRA. I'd love to see y'all in person.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Ciao.